I had wandered through life, angered by lies and through strife, through the malice in the cities so bright, and into the forests in the dead of night. I seen how the evils had impregnated the land, how most have fallen from the grace of God's hand, from the life of love and into that of disdain. Curse thine will with words so profane. Governments grew and corrupted with greed, blasphemous, bold, and enforcing their seed. Serpentine tongues of silver and gold, the freedom to do as we are told. Searching within and without for the righteous and true. When he came upon me, robes of violet and blue. His face unshaven, a beard of white, and beyond him there was a blinding light. He asked me to follow in his stead, and he would lead me through the home of the dead. And it was when I grasped his hand, we traveled swiftly across this land, over the mountains, through the breeze, past the plains and through the trees, to the wretched wood of dark imbued, where reality's seams had come unglued. The evil wood, wound and woven, toward the sound of hooves cloven. The blood-drenched branches upon me clawed, pleading for light and fatally flawed. And as we walked side by side, it was then I turned and asked my guide, "What is this to me that you show?" The reply that came was, "Look ahead, and you shall know." So I did as he said, and there upon the road ahead stood a gate, gnarled and twisted. Pointing there, my guide insisted. Ahead, we moved to its keeper, robed in black, just as the reaper. Yet, when I looked upon his face, I turned away from my own distaste, for his eyes were rotted out, his graying flesh all strewn about, barely clinging to visible bone, and his lips together were sewn. My guide informed me of this man's sin, a blasphemer, cursed to guard the secrets within. He had spoke of endless lies, and now he stands infested with flies. My guide spoke to the fraudulent fiend. That single word he did need. The word was jaw, clear, unbroken. And upon this one word spoken, from his belt the keeper retrieved that wretched gate's only key. And in its lock the key had turned by a gruesome hand, all boiled and burned. The gates swung open, screeching and screaming, into a cemetery, void and demeaning. Through the gate we did move, ever closer toward the sound of clicking hooves. We moved past the headstones ever-changing, the words upon them rearranging, from words of God to that of doom, of kin and clan to pain and gloom. The crosses fall, break and crack, as all behind us fades to black. We move past the endless dead, lined along the road ahead, and when the stones began to weather, the dead beneath them turned to leather. Then, with one single glance, we came upon the hooven dance. 6 of them moved round and round, a tomb of stairs into the ground. A tomb to where? I did not know, but to me my guide would surely show. Then we moved toward the tomb ahead, the goatmen dancing upon the dead. And down the stairs we did ascend, twisting and turning around the bend. We came into the catacombs, filled with bones and books and tomes. My guide spoke, "Seek not their information, for they are evil incarnation." And with that drilled into my mind, we continued down the wind. Down and on into a great hall where devils scratched within the walls. And from the ceiling hung by chains, beneath them pooled bloody stains. On those chains, hung by hooks, were shackled fiends, felons, and crooks. They were not dead. They moaned in pain, suffering for their unlawful gain. And then from the walls came the sound of laughter, echoing from floor to rafter. A laugh of nature, sick and twisted. Then the chains lowered and lifted, the sinner's flesh ripped and tore, and then some of them fell to the floor, only to be raised again, their flesh renewed to never end. I watched a blood drop as it fell. It hit the floor and rewound itself. It traveled back from whence it came, only so it could drop again. The screams continued and the laughter stopped, and the enslaven sinners ceased to drop. And thus we continued on, past the weeping, screaming cons. They again fell and flung from the chains where they were hung. We continued on past this sight, back to the dark, void of light. The stairs ahead led down, and then, again, they spun around. They led into another room, thick with sickness, death, and gloom. In this room was just a taste of a gluttonous heathen race. They lay shackled to the floor, and demons feed them forevermore, force-feeding feces down their throats, till their stomachs fill, split, and bloat. The demons, putrid, nasty things, producing excrement and to another bring, only to force it down into the gullets of those on the ground. They vomit, oh so vile, whereas the demons smile. And in the acidic excrement they drown, yet it continues to be force-fed down. My guide and I continued through, past those stomachs split in two, and as I passed that gruesome act, the act rewound, as the room before, their stomachs splitting forevermore. Their intestines, blood, and organs spilling out from their torsos, only to be sucked back in, to spill forever more so. We moved back into a hall dimly lit by fire, where screams did echo forth, bellowing so desire. That hall led into a cavern deep within the ground, where bushes grew without light, thorns sticking all around, and within the bushes there were ensnared bodies so bloody, infected, impaired. They screamed of their obscenities and blurted out their blasphemies. We moved down a path, past the bodies, thorn entrapped, ever toward a great gate within a gruesome wall, where there was another keeper, standing very tall. He looked down upon me, and I back up at him. It was then that he gave me a very wicked grin. His teeth curled and twisted, and cut into his lips. His hair was rough and ragged, and hung down to his hips. His eyes were red like fire that burned within his soul, and they told so blatantly that wickedry was his goal. His arms were thick and veiny, blood pulsing through his veins. His eyes still looked upon me, trying to drive me insane. His skin was gray and flaky, and also filled with boils, and the stench that wafted from him was that of eggs spoiled. His groin was covered by the hide of some great beast. The fur was wrapped around his waist and hung down to his feet. I could hear his heavy breathing piercing to my core, and I watched him drool mixed with blood, dripping to the floor. It was then my guide approached this creature, sickening in its every feature. He spoke but another word to pass, this one different from the last. The word was "Bull," spoken true, and the beast then knew just what to do. From his back a key he grabbed, and it turned by fingers scabbed. The gate then opened with a clank, and thus we passed that beast so rank. We passed beyond that great wall, when a rain of blood began to fall. It fell upon my robes so plain, covering me, red and stained. We moved to cover from the blood that fell, onward towards the lands of hell. We went forth into a cave, where the walls held enslaved, yet more men and women without rest, their backs and bellies to the stone, roots curling into their flesh. What was flesh or foliage? At times I could not tell. I passed the damned ones by, listening to them yell. They screamed of curses against the light, where against the roots they fight, but they fight to no avail, their bones snapping, oh, so frail. The roots were fed upon their blood, flowing down into the mud. The roots held up the people, standing on their toes, held against a freezing stone, where the roots forever grow. My guide and I continued on. Out the cave we passed. We moved beyond the roots' wretched grasp. Again, we seen a canyon cut out from the cliffs, and a tower with a bridge that stretched across the rift. A tower, tall and treacherous, stood before my eyes, a tower surely filled with darkness and demise. The path led onward, toward that wicked tower, and as I looked upon it, it seemed to pulse with evil's power. The steps led up, crooked and broken, to a door which slowly opened. It opened of its own accord to more stairs yet unexplored. The stairs led up and onward and through another path. The path led out onto the bridge above the cliffs of wrath, where winged beasts and dragons flew through the skies, piercing through the valley their wretched, shrieking cries. Harpies perched upon the bridge which stretched across the pit, their fur and feathers covered with dirt and grime and grit. The darkness in the pit below seemed to stir and swirl and glow. Before long, the bridge was crossed, with very little time lost, and to my surprise, on the other side of that dark and dismal vast divide stood 1,000 sinners lined along the cliff. They did not say a word, just stood there cold and stiff. They wept tears of blood for crimes they could not forgive, for these are the ones who threw away a life they could not live. And it was then from each side of that great bridge the people began to drop one by one from atop the ridge. They fell into the pit, and off the rocks they bounced, with sickening thuds and cracks so very loud pronounced. Their blood covered and stained the darkened cliffside face, and soon after one had dropped, another took his place. The process thus continued, dragging on and on, bodies forever falling into the abysmal beyond. My guide led me onward into another cave, wherein there were echoes of the cries of the depraved. In this cave were stairs that led into its floor. It was then I turned to my guide, and thus I did implore. I asked where it was we were to go deep within the ground, and he told me, "To the river where sinners forever drown." The stairs led down and down, seemingly forever, down into a room filled with bodies, bloodied and dismembered. Disembodied heads spoke with gurgled tone, blood dripping from their mouths as they rolled across the stone. Arms without bodies grasped about our feet. Forever they were longing only to be complete. Arms and legs all about, lying on the floor, heads and torsos all around, lying in pools of gore. We waded through the body parts, at times up to our knees. It was then we were hit by a wretched, foul breeze. The breeze came from a door not so far ahead, and the smell that came with it was the smell of the rotting dead. The stench of decaying flesh burned within my nose as the dismembered arms clung onto our clothes. We stepped out of the body parts and on to a wooden step, where maggots had collected and over the surface crept. The door led to more stairs from whence the breeze had came, and the stairs led to a beach, pitch black, its every grain. The beach was that of the river Styx, and lined along the beach, all laid out like bricks, were 1 billion bodies stacked in place to hold back the flood of souls disgraced. The bodies lie naked and thick with decay, all sewn together with disgust and dismay. I heard a gargled moaning from the river ahead, the sorrowful sounds of the drowning dead. We walked along the beach and out onto a pier, and there stood a tall, robed figure. Within me he struck fear. A hood shrouded his countenance in the darkest black, and every time he moved, his bones let out a crack. His fingers, long and gnarled, twisted toward his wrists. His skin boiled and cracked, pus oozing out of cysts. In his hands he held an oar made of all bones, and he stood there, waiting all alone. Here he stood forever, waiting for his coins, and if they did not pay, the drowning they did join. Beyond him floats a ferry upon a mist of souls, and there he stood, the ferryman, waiting for his toll. We moved ahead and did not pay. Instead, my guide spoke a word. The word was, "On," my guide said to the keeper, who came third. He led us onto the boat and began to row away, ever onward through the mists of endless souls so gray. As we rowed forward, the boat the dead did grip. However, when they tried to climb on board, their arms would snap or slip. "Do not look upon them," my guide had said, "for they may hypnotize and drag you down amongst the dead." We traveled down the river, toward a distant shore, over the endless souls, through the great river of yore. The ferryman never said a word as he rowed along, whereas the demons on the shore screeched a wretched song. They sang of Jubilon, a great beast of myth, a very powerful demon, so cunning, sly, and swift. They sang of the evil one, the king of lies, the beast. They shrieked on endlessly, so no one could get no peace. We drifted from the souls and out onto the sand, where the darkened grain stretched across the land. The ferryman pointed his finger long and cracked, pointing toward the desert with sand so dark and black. The storm brewed within the desert, with rain that burned my skin, and within the desert stood a wall. I knew not what laid within. The desert was not hot. Instead, it was cold as ice, and those who would walk upon it would surely pay a price. My guide informed me to duck down as we moved ahead, for anyone with their nose up high would surely join the dead. Upon these sands walked the sinners of pride, treading with their heads up high. From their stomachs all torn out, came chains so bloody, all strewn about, the chains around their body wrapped, a longer chain for a longer laugh. They walked barefoot on sands like glass, behind them a long and bloody path. We moved onward toward the wall, past the mighty, proud, and tall. I then found upon my next inspection that the wall stretched forever in either direction. Dead ahead there was a gate in that wall so vast. Here we found the next keeper, and at last there stood the three-headed beast, Cerberus, the hound of hell. He stood there feeding upon a man whom let out a cry for help. Then, before anything could be done, he ripped the man in three. This was a terrible and bloody thing to see. He swallowed the chunks of the man whole, each mouth getting a piece, and he began to roar at us as he finished up his feast. Then he charged at us, running at full speed, making the ground shake with a sound of 1,000 running steeds. My guide simply spoke one word that seemed to tame the beast. The word was the name Jubilon, from the song on the soul-filled sea. The beast halted in his tracks, sitting down to let us pass. As we passed, he licked his chops, where saliva and blood mixed, then dropped. The gate opened, and we passed by, the beast's eyes upon us the whole time. We passed through the gate, and into the lands of a sinner's fate. The land stretched down into a valley where bodies fell and rose the tally. The valley stretched down and down toward a canyon within the ground. The bodies fell and piled high, the sinners screaming painful cries, skewered by pitchforks in demons' hands, carrying them toward their proper plan. My guide informed me hell had many rings, each for a different dreadful thing, and that each ring had its master, the kings of darkness, death, and disaster. Past the field, dead ahead, was the first ring of the dead. This ring was for the shamed, the ones who lied for their own gain, for those who pointed fingers and accused, and those whom others' feelings used. The ones I seen punished first, all had cried, screamed, and cursed, falsely accusing friend for foe. Now they sit and wallow in woe. Greed by envy, a covetous brood, speaking with random words all construed. They walk in circles, mad with guilt, treading in piles of their own filth. Their hands were sewn over their eyes, stitched their face, and swarming with flies. Their eyes were covered so they could not see, for they only lie of their every deed. For every lie that they had told, their punishment would here unfold. Cuts were made by hands unseen for every lie of the unclean, and every cut oozed out pus that seemed to sting like salt and citrus. Their skin was rotting and peeling away with every sin they did pay. We walked onward past the split tongues many. The air was thick with disgust so heavy. Past the ring of liars came the ring of thieves, and in this ring rained down filth, all rotten and diseased. Maggots and mold fell from the sky and landed upon the ground. The festering piles grew and grew while writhing all around. And from the piles sprouted people all ripe with sin, and from their stomachs came coins of gold that burst out from within. The coins then turned to worms that burrowed into their skin so vile, only to turn back into coins, repeating all the while. The first duke we came across was master of rings 1 and 2, for he was the two-torso king, so vile and so crude. His legs were of average size, right up to his waist, but there his body split in two, each with its own wretched face. Their veins stretched and protruded from their skin, blood as dark as oil surely coursed within. In each torso, the rib cage clearly shone, skin thinly stretching tightly to the bone. They scratched at each other's skin, tearing at the flesh, and their mouths hung wide open, spewing forth a putrid breath. From their mouths came serpent tongues that coiled as they kissed, still all the while clawing and throwing fists. The twin beasts spoke their names in a hissing, gurgled tone. The one on the left was Astaroth. Lies and deceit made up his throne. The one on the right was named Loki, the trickster and the thief, the master of a deadly sin, the constructor of much grief. The twin beasts stood atop a hill of flesh and gore, just a small, soft-core taste of what these sinners had in store. My guide ushered me forward, not one bit perturbed, moving out of the second ring and on into the third. Here is where the gluttons fed on an endless feast, food all rotting, maggot-filled, and soaked in a bloody grease. The food consisted of such disgusting things as vomit soup, stuffed bladder, and gore-filled stew. There were also intestines stuffed with feces and cookies of glass and glue. The gore was laid out on a tabletop, a table which seemed to stretch forever, a table that didn't stop. The table stretched down one great hall with its ceiling way up high. In the air was the smell of burning flesh as it was being fried. My guide spoke to me.
Here is where the men stuff their faces until their stomachs burst. Yet, alas, my young friend, this sight is not the worst.
Soon the sinners grew ill from the putrid things they did eat. They then excreted out both ends, creating more food for their feast. We walked past naked obesities, on upward alongside the table, men and women eating flesh like horses at a stable. It took a long, long time before we reached where he sat, the king of force-fed gore, a master duke of fat. He needed 2 large chairs to hold up his behind. As he chewed upon intestines in his mouth, his teeth did grind. His cheeks were stuffed like a chipmunk's grin, for he was the lord of gluttonous sin. His skin was splitting and was filled with infection. He had a hideous face beyond even a mother's affection. He drooled out goo with a vile smell, the perfect embodiment of this ring of hell. With a mouth of gore, the beast spoke his name. He blurted out,
Belphegor.
The slobber falling down like rain. He was naked, his skin pale gray. He looked as if he had never seen the light of day. We moved onward past this beast, past the putrid and disgusting feast. The 4th ring was reserved for the cruel, for the ones who used pain as their tool. This is home for those that kicked their pets, for those who beat their wives. Now, here, they were in debt. First, we seen men tied to posts, as if they were a hound. This is where they were beaten down and down. They were beaten down to their hands and knees, curled in a crying heap. Their tendons were cut so they could not stand upon their feet. They were beat by demons of every size. They broke the sinners' bones and gouged out their eyes. The sinners, blinded, cried tears of blood as they were beaten down into the mud. The sinners were beaten on, beaten till they ceased to cry. They ceased their moans of pain and stopped begging for their lives. Then the demons grabbed each rope, retrieving one end from each post. And as they dragged the bodies away, they began to heal, their health regained. The sinners started to cry again, realizing the fate of their deeds. The demons dragged them past a fence and tied them onto steeds. The horse's flesh was black and gray and had begun to rot. Pieces of it fell away as the horses would trot. The horses reeked of decay and death, and the smell of blood was on their breath. They drug men across the ground, kicking them here and there and all around. Their skin was cut by stone beneath, scarring them from head to feet. Their bodies bruised and their bones did break, and they realized their life's mistakes. The horses raced down great, long tracks, pulling the sinners through stone and glass. We followed the horses down the track and toward a tower of rot, and on the tower stood a fiend way up at the top. His body thin and twisted, with scars cut so deep. His legs were long and thin, and he stood upon chicken feet. His arms were twisted, all curled around and bent, his bones breaking and sticking out, giving off a sulfuric scent. The beast's lower jaw stretched way out, stretching out the skin, and a long, thin beard of twisting hairs hung down from his chin. His ears were long and pointy and stuck out from his head, and his eyes were very bloodshot with a darkened shade of red. The beast looked down upon us and informed us of his name,
Belial,
the Lord and Master of torture and pain. He stood upon a tower of bodies, stacked way up high, one corpse atop another, right up to the sky. We moved onward, past the tower, which smelled so bad of death, forward to the next ring, as I tried to hold my breath. The next ring was for those who were in eternal unrest, for those of whom who threw away their lives despite giving it their best. We walked by bloody trees made of bone, and from each branch hung a noose. And therein hung so many bodies, not just one or two. We walked through the forest of the dead, onward, down the road so red. We moved through the forest and to a river, deep and red with blood, and the shores on either side were made of rotting flesh and mud. We followed the river against the stream, upon the ground so coarse. We followed its curving, winding path right up to its source. At the end was a fall of blood and gore, and from this cliff people were jumping off and plummeting to the shore. The blood of this river was flowing from the wrist of a giant beast who sat upon the cliff ahead, and we stood about his feet. Beside his leg were some steps that led on upward toward his neck. We ascended up the stairs, slightly slick with blood, and beside us lay 1,000 corpses, all sinking into the mud. We climbed past his calf and on up toward his knee, while demons danced around us, all with some sick glee. We climbed onto the cliff where the great demon sat, and there the path turned and led to a bridge across his lap. On the other side of the bridge was the wrist spewing blood, which gushed downward, causing that great red flood. We crossed the bridge that spanned his waist and looked up at the giant's face. His great eyes were dark and had yellowed with age, to the hue like the color of an ancient tome's page. His eyelids bled, cut off from his eyes, forever awake, and never to die. His nose curled downwards towards his lips, on a mouth that foamed with not just a drip. His mouth oozed a liquid, slimy and gross, and appeared as if he were given a poisonous dose. His skin was rotting and peeling from the bone and falling down upon his great mountain throne. He looked down upon us and spoke with a low, gurgled tone that came from his throat. The giant said,
Suton
was his name, the demon of hate and sorrowful shame. The beast seen my guide and let us pass on past the source of the blood river so long. We continued on up some more steps, up over his shoulder and on past his breath, a breath so vile it made me sick. I was more than happy to move on past it. Onward, we moved into the sixth ring, the sixth circle, the sixth layer. Here resided the proud, without a prayer. Ahead of us, the horizon burned a flickering red, and below us lay a valley filled with screaming dead. Their shrieks so loud and shrill pierced me to the bone. Beyond this valley, I knew there was another duke upon his throne. We moved into the valley toward the army of the dead, down towards those whom in life were misled. We moved down a long length of steps. They stunk of death and were made of human flesh. Each stairway led down into the riot of pride, each sinner a gross reflection of how they had died. Beneath their feet, many sinners were stacked, and many more danced upon them, with slit throats, gouged eyes, and knives stuck in their backs. All these people walked with their heads up high, ignoring those beneath them and blocking out their cries. When one would fall, another would stand to tread all over those who lay down on the land. They all suffered from various wounds, a fitting fate for the life they consumed. Some had wounds from blows to the head, others with slit throats with a dark shade of red. Others had knives that stuck out of their flesh, others of their backs, their necks, their stomachs and chests. Some had no eyes, no tongues, or no face, yet we still walked around with a feeling of grace. We set foot in the valley and moved through the pile of sinners so filthy, putrid, and vile. We walked past some men with no ears or no nose, trying to tread lightly upon those below. All those around us stomped and kicked upon those below them, so weak and sick. We walked slowly through the valley of the high and proud, stepping softly upon men, screaming so loud. And so through the crowd we moved on, men falling down to become the road to tread upon. It was then, dead ahead, we seen a giant orb of green, yet as we approached, I realized it was made of bodies all rotten and obscene. The bodies were twisted, bent, and tied into knots, and from them dripped bits of flesh as they would forever rot. But in the bodies there was a door, and beyond the door a room. Yet it was more like a crypt within a decaying tomb. All around the room were burning embers set into fleshy walls. They led up to the ceiling and onward down a hall. The hall led to a room so wide with a ceiling great and steep, and in the center of the room there was a pit so dark and deep. In the room dimly lit by burning embers so hot, I seen a cage hung by a chain above the pits of darkened drop. The chain ran through a pulley and on down to a hand garbed in a pure white glove, belonging to a man. It was not just the man's glove that was a blinding white. He also wore a suit and tie that stood out oh so bright. Yet only in the darkness did his suit brightly shine, for when it hit the embers of light, it turned to rags covered in grit and grime. In the darkness, his teeth were pearly white, just as was his suit, and his eyes were a piercing, beautiful baby blue. But in the light, his teeth turned to a rotting black, and his eyes were bloody and eaten out from some unknown attack. In the dark, he had long blonde hair that shone brightly in my eyes, yet in the light it turned to twisted horns, revealing his lies. Upon the man's face was a very sinister smile, and as he spoke to us with a cunning voice so sneaky and so vile, he said his name was
Caesar,
the Master of the Proud, and when he seen my guide's face, our passage he allowed. He lowered the cage and opened the door for us to step in, and then down and down we were lowered, down into the pit. We were lowered on and on, deeper down and down, lowered for what seemed like miles, deep into the ground. Soon below us came into view a glowing golden light. A light shot up the darkened shaft, flickering so very bright. The shaft opened into a canyon lit by pools of molten gold. The pools were filled by flowing walls that came from various holes. The holes were scattered all about within the ceiling walls, and from the holes came varying degrees of golden falls. Some of the molten falls came out of statues filled with jewels. The gold spilled from out their veins and gushed down into pools. As we were lowered down into the chasm, we heard the echoes of screaming phantasms. Soon the cage hit the ground atop a tall, golden mound. The canyon was humid and filled with steam, and the demons all around us bellowed their piercing screams. Down below the mound, which upon we stood, gathered those who hoarded what they could. In life they took more than what was needed, while others suffered, their lives sad and depleted. Men and women gathered all around to drink from the pools of gold within the ground. And as they drank the molten gold, their hands and faces melted to the bone. They, however, did not stop. Instead, they gorged some more, and it melted through their stomachs and down onto the floor. And when their hands had melted away, they bent down, and to my own dismay, they buried their faces into the molten ore, bleeding and melting in a frenzy of gore. I seen them gathering for miles at the pools, melting their faces off as greedy old fools. We moved off the mound and over a bridge to a cliff, the molten pools below us flowing down into a rift. I followed my guide down a diamond inlaid path, while others around us cried in pain, and around us demons laughed. Our shoes protected us from the diamonds cutting our feet, while those who were around us were left to walk and bleed. The diamonds appeared as rubies running thick with red, as they were walked upon by the many sluggish dead. We moved down the diamond path, onward toward a golden palace. The palace was formed with grotesque bends that added a hint of malice. We walked up to its giant doors that stretched way up so many floors. The doors were filled with precious jewels, and all over were etchings of demons and ghouls. From the palace windows came a hazy glow, a reddish tint amongst the gleaming gold. We approached the door that opened fast, and from the palace came a foul gas. The gas appeared as a thick green mist, and its disgusting smell made me sick. We stepped inside the first room, which was filled with that thick, green, hazy gloom. I covered my face and moved on in, my fingers covering from nose to chin. The green mist came from pulsating sacs set in the walls amongst bleeding cracks. This room was alive and seemed to breathe, and from its cracks, pure red it did bleed. Through the room we came to another set of doors, and when they did open, they screeched across the floor. In the next room we discovered the source of the glow, the red, glowing haze from the palace window. It came from white walls covered in red, reflecting with light the blood of the dead. Hanging from the ceiling were ornaments of gore, decapitated heads and severed limbs galore. The color contrast was sick and grim in this room so heavy with sin. My eyes then moved down to a tall throne made of thousands of human bones. Every bone was dipped in gold to shine, and in every skull's eye there was a gem to find. Every gem was there, from ruby to sapphire, and sinners stood beside it in blood-drenched attire. Upon the throne sat a demon, the great king of greed, and those who stood near him were all of his creed. The tall beast's skin was of a sickly yellow, all wrinkled and aged, a sneering old fellow. His skin was frail, and it cracked when he moved, and the cracks oozed a pus that matched his skin's hue. He was dressed in fine purple linens. Here sat a king and a master of sins. His nose stuck out, all pointy and round, and his eyes were of a very dark brown. When he opened his mouth, his teeth could be seen, all turned a disgusting yellow and green. His ears stuck out and pointed up into the air, and from his head sprouted long, matted hair. The demon informed us of his title as king.
Lord Mammon,
the master of material things. He was the ruler of the Ring of Greed, a fitting fiend for this sin indeed. Mammon raised his arm, and his skin cracked, and with his fingers he made a loud snap, a snap so loud it gave out a boom, and there appeared doors in the center of the room. They hovered without wall, ceiling, or floor, and thus we moved onward, on towards those doors. My hands grasped the handles of this evil entry, and I did not look back at demon or sentry. The door swung open to a great desert of red, and in front of me was a path lined with impaled heads. The doors slammed shut behind us as soon as we stepped through. The doors then disappeared, leaving us only one thing to do. We moved on by the heads, which all had no eyes. The heads were hollowed out, all darkened black inside. As we walked by, each head would turn upon its pole, always staring at us with darkened, eyeless holes. We moved past many heads before one spoke a word. He moaned of obscenities, blasphemous and absurd. The others followed suit in their moans, with various obscene and angry tones. They screamed of crimes against the Lord, and cried in pain forevermore. We finally came to where the bodies laid. They stretched out for miles, dismembered and decayed. The bodies lay for miles upon the ground, and suddenly there was not a sound. Long we walked in the silence so dead, much like the road upon we tread. My guide then turned to me and said,
"These are the silent fields of the misled."
His words were spoken with a whispered tone, a side effect of this land unknown. A deaf ear was turned to this place, this garbage dump for the disgraced. We moved on over top of them all, hoping all the while I would not fall. We came to the end of the rotting field where a great step pyramid was revealed. All of its stones were black and polished so bright, and mixed with this land's reddish hue, it reflected a purple light. On each step there lined men nailed onto trees, and when you looked upon them, it was fire they did bleed. Their blood was made of everlasting fire, and there they burned forever, their pain so harsh and dire. Steps led up the middle, lined with streams of blood, streams that fed the trees which had not leaf nor bud. Atop the pyramid there stuck out 2 thorny horns, with several human bodies tacked upon their thorns. We ascended up to the pyramid's peak, as demons danced around us, seeing what havoc they could wreak. At the top we came to a demon of great yore, a heretic king chained to his throne who could laugh no more. He spoke not a word, yet I heard him in my head. He was
Balim,
the master of these forsaken dead. His eyes and mouth had been sewn shut tight into his face. Forever this demon would be silenced, to his own disgrace. His chains were hooked to a chair and skin alike, hooks piercing to the bone through skin a pale white. His hands were tied down to his throne with rusty old barbed wire, and around him there forever raged a burning fire. Then suddenly the ground gave way, and we fell down through the floor. We fell downward on and on into the temple's core. At long last we reached the bottom, a murky, green, and swampy place. We fell into the disgusting muck of this forsaken space. It did not take me long to climb from out this bog, crawling out of the mud to lean against a log. It was then that I realized that this was no log of wood. Instead, it was a petrified leg of one who'd done no good. Corpses everywhere, petrified and formed into twisted trees. The only sign of life was a sick, green moss that clung to them like leaves. The moss grew thick and formed a path through this misty muck. My guide then told me that here is where the envious were stuck. The atmosphere fit the sin, green with envy, held within. We walked down the moss-strewn path, all the while hearing a squealing laugh. Where the laugh originated I did not know, yet I continued across the moss, thickly grown. We moved forward toward the sound, echoing louder and louder from all around. The only other sound was from the demon frogs, whom hopped and croaked all about the bog. They were some putrid, hideous beings, toad-faced and bloated, all rotten and green. They oozed a pus from their pores, disgusting and yellow, and when they croaked, it was loud. They let out quite a bellow. We then moved onward past these beasts, who swam through the water and clung onto the corpse trees. The laughter grew even louder as we moved down the path. Piercing into my mind was that squealing laugh. Soon, the sound of an ocean's waves rolled in and mixed with the laughter of this mistress of sin. On up ahead, the moss turned to stone, and at the sea's edge stood a towering throne. Beyond the throne raged a powerful storm, and lightning flashed to highlight the beast's wretched form. There she sat, a sickening beast, with patches of hair all over her and large, hooving feet. Her hair grew in patches all over her body, twisting and curling, splitting and knotting. She smelled of feces and vomit so vile, and atop her short neck was a grimacing smile. She had a pig's face, with tusks sticking out, and snot came oozing out of her snorting snout. She had 6 vile breasts, all lined with veins, and 2 big clawed hands, both ready and willing to maim. It was then that this putrid beast then said,
"I am Asmodia, queen of the envious dead."
She blurted it out in a squealing pig tone, and as she shifted about upon her great throne, the plain sight of the beast made my stomach feel sick, and the smell just added to it, disgusting and thick. Behind the pig beast stood a great tower so high, with stairs wrapped around it, on up, by and by. We moved past the swine and on up the steps, with no railing to hold on to, on neither the right nor the left. As we moved up the tower, I watched the sea's tide, with deep swirling waters and waves way up high. The rain that fell was freezing yet burned, and on either side of the tower the ocean's waves churned. Atop the tower a great bridge we did see, a bridge so long it spanned the vast sea. I could see the bridge stretch out for as far as my eyes would allow, and the ocean's waves shook it with crashes so loud. As I looked down to the water, I could see bodies that floated. They ranged in all manners, from sickly to bloated. And beneath them I seen something that further disturbed me. I seen a long, twisting shadow of a serpentine body. The shadow stayed close to the bridge, beneath the waves, swimming within a mass watery grave. We continued straight along the bridge's course, as the shadow moved between the massive bridge's supports. The shadow moved in and out between these giant beams, then the wind bellowed forth, carrying with it woeful screams. In the distance, tornadoes formed, swirling in the blood-red sky, and it wasn't long before their spinning winds were very close by. The twisters touched down upon the sea, and the winds picked up the many dead bodies. As the bodies spun, they sprang to life, and all let out screaming and painful cries. The winds twisted and molded them into grotesque creatures, twisting them in sexual ways and contorting their features. The winds forced genitals to sodomize, and then they grew to a massive size. They tore the skin and ripped the flesh, accompanied by screams of pain and gasps of breath. Their flesh would fuse and mold into one. This was their punishment for their painful fun. Others were women with labias torn, their stomachs rotting with maggots and babies unborn. Their breasts would swell and burst with gore, all crying and pleading for no more. Others were still left intact, but their tears would fall and their faces would crack.
These are the adulterers, rapists, harlots, and whores.
My guide had turned his head and informed. Then, just as fast as they had come about, the tornadoes stopped and spit the twisted sinners out. Some fell back down and splashed into the sea, yet others fell onto the bridge ahead of me. They flopped and crawled across the ground, all the while making groaning and slopping sounds. We weaved between them very swiftly. Their bodies, all bloody, were twisting and shifting. Their body parts all morbidly fused. They suffer now for the pain that they used. The shadow still moved beneath the waves, now pulling bodies down with it along the way. It wasn't long before the shadow showed its true form. First, out came its spines and its horns. All down its back was a row of spines, all twisting and curling and moving in time. Its horns twisted around to the opposite side and moved down its face right next to its eyes. Its eyes glowed yellow with a small red haze, and its teeth, in rows like a shark, matched the red shade. Rows of flippers lined its great sides, connected to its blood-stained and leathery hide. Its tail had giant pincher-like claws, and on the other end, its massive dragon-like jaws. This beast did not speak. It would only roar and screech. My guide told me the name this serpent went by:
Leviathan, the ruler of hell's lustful tides.
It was quiet and dark as night, completely empty and void of light. The silence here was deafening, so quiet it was threatening. Then, all of the sudden, without any warning, the sky lit up just like it was morning. The flash was followed by a thunderous boom, and then, all around us, chaos ensued. Bodies were burning and blown into bits, along with explosions of anger and gunfire fits. We were hit and nearly thrown off our feet by a blast of energy filled with static-like heat. People ran towards us from the direction it came, all moaning and crying and screaming in pain. They gasped for air with their moans, and their flesh was burned and left dangling from bone. While they ran by, they were shot in the back with bullets and arrows by demons that laughed. They would all fall and appear to be dead, but would return to their feet, even with shots to their head. Explosions like thunder burst all around. Bodies lay twisted and mangled all over the ground. Body parts wriggled and writhed on the floor. Piles of bodies, all loaded with gore. The explosions continued as we passed them by, towering flames burning into the sky. The flames ahead burned higher and higher. They curled around above us like a cave in the fire. As we ventured on through the cave of flames, we seen in the walls many sinners, all mangled and maimed. Windows into madness opened in the walls, the fires fading to reveal it all. Windows opened to reveal millions in pain, all rotting and mangled and driven insane. When the flames had revealed their secrets beyond, the fires would close back up and let us move on. We moved on through the cave of fire, out into an opening where we seen a great castle's spires. The castle stood tall and was black as night, yet it burned brightly with the fire's light. The fires stretched and swirled around its tower's sides, burning and flickering off into the sky. The castle's large doors opened up wide, and then they slammed shut once we were inside. I spun around, frightened by the band of the doors, not knowing behind me what was in store. I spun around once more to see a long hallway stretched out ahead of me, and all down the hallway, lining the walls, were grotesque demons, some standing short and some tall. Some had horns that sprung up from their heads, some were all bones, appearing rotting or dead. Others had appendages that should not have been there, twisting around them and pulling their hair. Some were short and fat at the hips, while others were tall with teeth pierced through their lips. Some stood headless, with fanged mouths in their hands. Others stood bleeding and swollen with cancerous glands. Some wore armor, all battered and worn, while others stood naked, with genitals torn. Many had bodies contorted and curled, some of them men, and some of them girls. Some had breasts which were cut open and split. More wore human skin, all stretched out to fit. Many, like masochists, cut at their skin, and darkness like smoke around those most ripe with sin. We walked on past their constant glare, feeling discomfort from their endless stare. The hallway's end we seen up ahead, for there was a door, a bright shade of red. We stopped at the door, and I turned to my guide, and for the first time, I seen fear in his eyes. My guide then warned me of the devil ahead, the master of murder, a warlord of the dead. Some call him Devil of the blood-stained sands. He is feared by many across all the lands. This warlord is Satan, the king of hate, the lord and master of a murderer's fate. The door opened up to the throne room of the beast, and when we had entered, he interrupted his feast. He fed upon corpses, blood-soaked and red, as he sat upon a throne of fresh severed heads. His legs were a horse's, but he sat like a dog, a humanoid torso on top that ate like a hog. His skin stained red with eons of pain, his eyes stared through me, and his soul was insane. To either side of him were railings, all made out of bone, which hooked to gold stairways, all etched in with stone. They led down to a floor made of gold, where in the center there was a giant hole. The beast jumped down from atop his throne, and then ran past the railings made out of bone. His hooves hit the floor and roared with a clap, and I readied myself for the beast's attack. He grabbed my throat and held me up high, and I thought that then I would surely die. He looked past my eyes and into my soul, and held me over that wretched hole. He was angered by our interruption of his feast of those filled with corruption. He looked to my guide and said with a growl,
"Why do you come to my kingdom so foul?"
And then, before my guide could speak, the beast looked angeredly back at me. He let me drop into the pit, and I fell down into the abyss. As I dropped, I screamed and yelled. I begged for my salvation as I fell. Suddenly, my falling ceased, and I was in the hand of a giant beast. His skin was yellowed and looked deceased, his eyes appearing to be displeased. Those eyes set in 3 massive heads, all soaked with blood and appearing red. The head on the left was that of a cat. It growled and hissed, and its fur was black. The head on the right was that of a toad. It was large and green, and it bellowed and croaked. The center head wore a crown. It was that of a man, and wore a frown. He had 4 great arms with 4 large hands, and then leaned forward, the head of the man. He opened his mouth to reveal a tongue that was trident-shaped. It was forked into 3, and it moved like a snake. He then spoke to me in 3 separate tones. One hissed, one croaked, and the other groaned. He spoke to me his unholy name,
Jabulan,
the master of this pit of shame. It was then I seen the walls of the pit. They were lined with corpses, all sewn to fit. These corpses were not separate beings. Together, they formed one entity. This second beast held up the first, and both in this pit were cursed. Legion was the second beast, holding Jabulan by his hands and feet. The beasts together judged my doom, and in one quick gulp, I was consumed. I fell into his stomach like an abyss. Downward I fell into the darkness. I hit the bottom with a smack, and all around me there was only black. I laid there, sore, upon the ground, my surroundings all devoid of sound. And then, suddenly, in my head, a voice whispered, and to me it said,
"This is what I give to those whose power full of evil grows. I give to them all you can see and hear. They can do as they please."
I then replied to those words, "There is nothing here, and that's absurd." I had yelled, but there was no sound. I yelled out loud, but no voice came out. There were no sounds or sights to see, only the darkness that swallowed me. I screamed again and really fought, and then again. No sound was caught. And then, again in my mind, I heard the voice for a second time. It told me how to find the truth in the land of hell's deepest roots, far beneath me, deep below, where the ground is frozen, white like snow. A flame appeared to light the path to a palace of frozen wrath. The ground here was frozen ice, and the sky above was black as night. I came up to the great ice palace, stretching and twisting, all filled with malice. I walked across a bridge so cold, over an endless pit below. The doors of the palace opened wide to reveal the darkness inside. Alone, I slowly walked through the doors, not knowing what I had in store. My body trembled from both fear and cold, a combination that pierced through my soul. The doors closed behind me once I was in, and dead ahead sat the Lord of all sin. I could not see him, for his back was turned, the air around him so cold my skin burned. I seen broken ice that pointed and arced with jagged edges that were razor sharp. I approached the ice thrown ahead of me, a sharp and jagged, frost-covered seat. I heard a laughter from its other side, maniacal and echoing far and wide. Then came footsteps from around its arms, and out stepped a figure in familiar garb. It was then I was shocked to see the man that stood ahead of me. He stood in violet and blue, his face unshaven, and then I knew. Hell's master and the Lord of Lies was guiding me here all this time. The man that had led me here was the origin of my every fear. My guide's name was Lucifer, the Lord and Master Blasphemer, the sinner of the web of lies, to entrap there his loyal flies. He then told me why I was picked to come and witness all of this. He said I was neither alive nor dead, but in my life I'd been misled. I had lived a life of sin, and then I hoped to be forgiven. Would my sins be forgot, or would I be left here to rot? It was then that his face changed, his features contorted and rearranged. His eyes sunk back into his face. With 2 dark holes they were replaced. His skin then loosened and sunk down, turning his mouth to a sagging frown. Every hair then slowly fell from his beard, and on each side of his face the balding was mirrored. Then, suddenly, from the ceiling, the floor and walls all around, came 100 chains, all rusty and brown. On each chain's end, a hook with a razor-sharp tip, which sunk deep into the flesh of his legs, his arms, his chest, and his hips. They also cut into his stomach, his face, his feet, and his hands, pulling his flesh until he appeared as no longer a man. He appeared now as a mass of flesh that bled until the chains split apart his head. His body began to split apart in a mass of gore, slowly revealing within it the beast's true form. First, out from the shell came a shadow-like mist, followed by 2 frost-covered fists. His skin was frostbitten and had turned black and blue, not more one than the other, but a mixture of the two. Following the hands came 2 arms, all covered in veins, blood frozen inside and burning with pain. The beast hid his face as he was revealed, fur-covered legs from his waist to his heels. His chest was cut open to reveal no heart, only a frozen ribcage broken and split apart. On his feet, all his toes had rotted away, and he stood there on stubs, all black and decayed. His fleshy disguise had been ripped in 2 to reveal this beast, decaying and blue. His disguise hit the floor and rapidly rotted, right near his legs that were covered in hair that was knotted. The beast then finally showed his true face. It was void of emotion, with no features in place. There was really no face, just a smooth black surface, like a frost-covered dome, which I knew not its purpose. It was then its function I realized, when the smooth dome sprouted a mouth, a nose, and some eyes. His face transformed into a beautiful one, with piercing blue eyes and hair like the sun. His face went pale, but appeared to glow. I knew this was all a lie, just for show. He told me he could appear in any form, as grotesque and ugly, or gentle and warm. His face then again transformed once more, shedding its skin down onto the floor. Several great horns twisted out of his head, all disgusting and sticky, bloody and red. His eyes went black, as dark as night, and before me stood a hideous sight. The beast's mouth hung open wide to reveal his jagged, twisting teeth inside. His mouth dripped saliva that quickly froze, and down each icicle, blood slowly flowed. His tongue was forked and all cut from his teeth, and blood dripped from his mouth and down to his feet. His nose was curled upward, and it puffed out some smoke, and the skin on his face was all cracked open and broke. The skin went gray and wrinkled with age. It aged so quickly, it began to decay. Some of his horns curled back into his skin, only to cut through and poke back out from within. I quickly thought of what I should do to escape the beast, all black and blue. Before I could react, the hooked chains returned. They dug into my flesh, and so cold they burned. They dug into my arms and my legs just the same. They cut down to my bone and filled me with pain. Pieces of my flesh ripped off and fell to the ground as the chains continued to cut in all around. Blood began to gush out from my wounds, and then I knew that I was doomed. I had done wrong, and there was now no escape. I could do nothing but accept my own fate. The hooks continued to pierce through my skin 100-fold for every one sin. My left arm was then ripped out of its socket, and it flew off my body as if it were a rocket. My blood would spill out and freeze on the floor, only to be continuously covered with more. I screamed out in pain, but there was no pity. Only more hooks buried within me. My right leg then followed in my left arm's stead, leaving behind it a puddle of red. My body went limp and hung from the chains, blood spilling to the floor and leaving its stains. I cried tears of blood that ran down my cheeks, knowing then that my future was bleak. I then heard a million voices, all in my head, an army of wailing souls of the dead. The voices began to drive me insane as chunks of my flesh were ripped out by chains. Soon, there was no skin left to be ripped, and there on the floor was a pile of it. Then my flesh began to crawl on the floor, writhing and slithering pieces of gore. They crawled onto my body and back to their place, reattaching themselves from my feet to my face. Soon, my body was once again whole, only for me to again pay the toll. And now, here forever, my fate was to cry, to suffer forever, and never to die. I then looked up, and there I seen the light of peace shining down on me. The light had cut through every ring down here where he was king. The beast then stopped. He looked enraged, with a snarling grimace upon his face. Then hooked chains burst forth from under his skin, out of his chest and arms. They came to do me in. Those chains came at me at a mighty speed, but they were suddenly stopped by the light of peace. The chains coiled and circled the light, but they could not reach me inside. It was then that I was lifted off of my feet, and as I floated away, I became more at peace. I heard the beast scream in rage, his chains reaching up for my legs. Their every attempt was thwarted by the light, and then, soon, I was out of reach, but he would not give up his fight. The light had ripped through Jablon's gut, and out of his stomach it carried me up. The hands of Legion grabbed at me, but the light burned their skin so very deep. I was carried up, on out of reach, but those chains continued and followed me. The light carried me up past Satan's throne. He seen me and let out a guttural groan. He rushed the light and grabbed at my chest, but the light cut right through his bicep. The light turned Satan's arm to dust, and his blood spilled out, all filled with rust. I left the beast screaming by his throne, and I left the ring of hatred's home. I moved upward, out a hole in the sea, while Leviathan circled all around me. He bit and lunged at the light, but he would never venture inside. I was carried away from the serpent's reign, on above Asmodeus' swamp of envy and pain. She screamed in anger and clawed at me, but her disgusting limbs could not reach. I was pulled back up by the heretic's fire, past Baalim, bound by chains and wire. His chains then mingled with the ones that had followed, chasing me through where the light had hollowed. I was pulled out of the temple of the heretic, and on through the door of the greedy and sick. Mammon appeared to look surprised, with a glint of anger within his eyes. He tried to tempt me with his gold, but he was a liar, too greedy and cold. When he seen his lies had no effect, he threw bars of gold at me, right and left. The bars hit the light and reflected back, landing with a thud upon his lap. The demon buried himself in greed as I traveled away from his sinful deeds. I moved on upward through the shaft, where I was lowered down by Azazel's craft. As I moved by, his true face was shown with the light's powerful glow. He hissed at me as I passed by him, but he did not touch me. He had too much pride. I was pulled back past the rivers of blood and up near the giant sitting in mud. He reached for me with his massive hands, but when they touched the light, they turned to sand. The sand was a deep red hue and fell upon the piled dead. Buchan let out a groan of pain and blurted out words so profane. I was pulled back past the suicides and into the abusive ring, back through the wretched land where Belial was the king. The light had cut through his massive jaw, and he laid back all twisted and bent. I still remembered his disgusting smell, but I could not smell its scent. I was pulled back into the halls of gluttonous sin, where I again seen his vile grin. There, Belphegor sat upon his double throne, his fat rolling off his body and hiding every trace of bone. He threw his plates of gore at me, but they reflected back into his face. He watched me rise above him with a look of disgust and disgrace. I was pulled out of the gluttonous ring, back up by the two-torso king. Astaroth and Loki clawed at my robes, however their fingers cracked and fell off before they could reach my clothes. The beasts then screamed and beat each other to take out their rage, as I was pulled onward and out of Cerberus's gate. He lunged at me, but his chains made him cease. I then looked back to see those hooked chains still reaching for my feet. I flew back over the river Styx, where the ferryman was rowing, onward, up in the peaceful light that was glowing. I flew on past the second gatekeeper, the giant by the wall. He screamed curses at me and wished for me to fall. I was pulled past him and right back to the start, where the first gatekeeper stood, rotting with his lack of heart. He reached out for me, but was too weak to pierce the light. I was pulled back into the forest, where it was no longer night. There, I seen my body laying beneath a tree. Then I felt my soul get pulled back into me. There I awoke beside my fire pit. Not a burning ember was left inside of it. I sat up and wondered if it had all been a dream. Then I heard a whisper in the wind from what it seemed. The whisper told me to go forth and do what is right, to rid the world of its evils, and not give up this fight. So I beg you all to save the world as the whisper said, so we do not all wind up within this realm of the dead. Social media can be very unpredictable, especially regarding horror content. If this content gets removed, all new content will be simultaneously presented on various websites provided in the description to this video. Make sure to follow me in other digital spaces so that you never miss out on the terror. Also, if you like this video, make sure to leave a comment and hit the like button. It helps the channel a lot. If you're new to the channel and you enjoy what's here, consider hitting that subscribe button and the notification bell so that you never miss an upload. Writing is a dream of mine, and it's all of you that make that dream come true.